Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to do a quick code review as well as some tweaks to our code. And I know the last lesson was fairly long, but we did have to structure all of this data, this JSON data, in a more usable format. And that format was already dictated to us in the beginning when we structured our data. So there's a number of different ways that we could handle this, and going through this and iterating through all the different values, that's one of the best ways to do it. And usually the way that I work with it is I will use something like JSON lint so I can see the content and returning back each one of those items, especially within these arrays, and then returning back and getting that content that I want to make use of. So we can remove all of the console messages. Coming into our project, we needed a way to load data. So we've got some default data that's sitting there within the My Data object. And I'm going to move some of this stuff up to the top, as this is where we're setting and initiating all of our initial variables as well as our adding in the events. So make this bigger so we can take a closer look at the content. So we didn't have any styling. We did this all with JavaScript, so we didn't have any styling at all. And this was all done via JavaScript. So we had a little bit of styling that we were applying to the elements. And before, what we did is we set up a couple elements to create some interaction for the user, so a button and an output area. We didn't really utilize the output area a whole lot. We could also put in some messaging and additional content in there as needed. So we came in first and we set a global variable of URL. And this is because we're going to be constructing a URL using JavaScript. And this also gave us the option to check if that URL exists and clear that out. And I'll show you that function afterwards as well. The one that we were using was that create object URL. And then over here, we needed to revoke the object URL. Otherwise, we can't click and download it over and over again, because as it's going to be sitting and it'll create some memory leak issues. So that's always a good way to do that keep this globally. Next, we had a few variables that we needed to set up, and one of the variables is the feed ID. So this also makes it easy if you have different spreadsheets that you can have different feed IDs and updated, and that can update the feed URL that you use and give you options to get multiple spreadsheets. All you have to do is go over to the Google spreadsheet, make sure that it's shared, and then using the object ID of the Google spreadsheet, you use that as the feed ID, and then the rest of the URL is the same. So whether you're using your project or my project, all of these URLs are going to be the same. The only thing that ever differs is this feed ID. So that's the most important one. We needed a way to trigger the loading of the content. So we made sure that our DOM has loaded, and that was the ideal spot to load the JSON data. We've got some default My Data that we were using originally, and this can also stay into the project in case for whatever reason you have some problems loading the data, or the data is taking a long time to load. This way the user is actually going to get something. So you could leave this into your project, or you could remove it out. And this also serves as a way to structure the content that we need within our CSV file. So it's also a good indicator of how to structure the content. Next, we selected the elements from the page and created them as objects in our JavaScript. And for the button one, we added some styling and then added an event listener. And whenever that gets clicked, then what we're doing is we're sending the My Data to create the CSV function. This was the load JSON function. This is the one that we did in the last lesson, and it was fairly complex, and mainly because of our JSON feed was so complex that we had to, so we did the fetch, returned back the JSON object, and then returned it back as a JSON data object, and then using a variable called data, that's where we had all of the data. And because the data, it was a huge object, it had a feed and entry. And entry is the one where it contained all of the rows and columns of information. So that's the one that we went to use. And we used for each to loop through each one of those rows. We set up a few different arrays. So one was our main array. So this is the one that we're going to use in order to build out our My Data structure. And we also wanted one for heading, because the way that the Google Sheet works is that the headings, as their object names, it's fairly difficult to add it into an array because it will skip the first row and treat it as a heading. So we needed to have a separate array in order to add that in. And that's where we also did the first run. So we want the first time through in order to update headings so that we could add it into the main array as our first item within that array. So next we looped through, so we got a key as an item. So we saw within item, we had a whole bunch of content that was being returned back, and we wanted to loop through that content. So it was in an object format. So we created a loop with the object content where we were getting the object value, the paired values as key, and returning it through item. Then what we were looking for is if key had a starting value of GSX, and we know if it has a starting value of GSX, that was one of the values that we wanted to use. And the GSX indicated the GSX, it had a $sign, and then it had the heading as the object key. So we also used that in order to get the object number, so we were doing item key, but we could also use the $sign. So this is where the actual content was held, and this is where we were getting the heading. So we're building up that first item in our array. So checking again to see if it's first run, and if it is, we're adding item as the heading array as our first item in the array, and then we weren't running it again. So then this was only run through the first time to get the heading information and pushing it into the main array, and then afterwards we're just pushing the holder items in. So going through all of that, and as we iterated through, we slowly built out main array, and then once we've created the main array object, we assigned it to my data, so that effectively removed this and added in the contents coming from our spreadsheet. We also had a function in order to create our CSV. So this was a create CSV function, so we can send any type of data in there. So if we had multiple spreadsheets, multiple data, we can use the same function to create the CSV. We needed a file in order to hold our contents, as well as another variable in order to build our content. So we set those up as some default variables. We also checked to see if the URL exists, and this was where we're revoking the object URL and we're creating that object URL. We needed to create a file name, so this file name can also be dynamic. You can change the values. So right now it's just always calling it test CSV. You could call it something else. We needed also to, when we create the file object, we needed properties. So we needed a file name, we needed properties. So properties, you can specify the type of file you're creating. We saw earlier that we can create a text file, or we can take a CSV file. So this is the format to create a CSV file, the different types. We looped through all of the contents of data. So because this was in an array format, we looped through all of them, and we had to make sure that we're cleaning up the items that are contained within that array, because we saw that if we had commas in there and a few other characters or line breaks, that they could potentially create issues. So we had to wrap around with the double quotes in order to break out and be able to utilize those characters in our string. So we built and we restructured the cell, always making sure that it's within a string format, of course, and then returning it back as a cleaned version. So just using that function to clean it, and as we clean those rows of contents, then the next row is just indicated with a line break. Next, we created the file. So using the new file, the object creator, we passed in our content, and we also passed in a file name and then some properties. And in order to make it downloadable so the user doesn't have to click a link, we created a hyperlink dynamically. We attached the URL, so we created a URL object. We set the attribute of the link as the URL. We set the attribute of the download as the file name. We made it in visibility as hidden, even though there's no content within that anchor text. We did make it hidden just in case. And so this isn't visible to the user. We appended it to the body. We initiated the click of that link, and then we removed it from the body. So we removed child, so we still have that link object. And then lastly, so what that did is that created the click on the link and made it download whenever we clicked that main button within our HTML. So that's a quick run through of the code, and you're welcome to try it out for yourself. And I do encourage you to take the source code. It has been provided. and see what you can do with it. Practice working with the code in order to practice more about what can be done with the document object model, as well as some of these utility functions that are available within JavaScript. Thanks again for taking the course, and if you have any questions or comments, I'm always happy to address them.